John Foreman was the UK defence attaché to the Russian Federation from 2019 to 2022 and advised senior UK officials and ministers on Russian military and security affairs and represented the UK Chief of Defence Staff to the Russian General Staff. As we have discussed in previous conversations, he had a front row seat for the tense meetings and negotiations that immediately preceded Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine in February 2022. He is now an independent consultant specializing in Russia, Ukraine, and international security and has over 20 years of diplomatic, operational, and corporate experience in the defense and security sector. I strongly advise you to check out our previous conversations. They are some of the best on the channel and the most insightful, as you'd expect, given his extraordinary experience. Now, before we jump in, just a big thank you to everyone on the channel who supports us through Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, and of course, in watching the videos, in liking, sharing them, etc. You'll all know that we've been doing a series of events this year. That all costs quite a bit of money in terms of travel, accommodation, and so on. So your generous support to make these happen is absolutely critical. And I can announce as well that the next set of events are coming up in Lviv, Kyiv, and Odesa at the end of July. So thank you for helping to make all of this happen. John, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good to be back. After a year, I think was last time we were talking.
It's a year, isn't it? And goodness me, a lot has happened, but also a lot seems to have stayed the same, including I would almost characterize of ongoing chicken Kiev thinking, which is not embracing the idea that Ukraine needs to win and needs to regain its full sovereign territories. Where are we in terms of Western policy towards any concept of peace and victory?
Yeah, I think 12 months ago, obviously we're still with Biden and escalation management, and Congress have been mucking around with supply of arms to Ukraine as part of this policy that Ukraine can't win but shouldn't lose. And that has sort of driven the amount of arms being given by the Americans and others to Ukraine. I'm not sure that policy has changed dramatically. I don't think Trump has changed that policy from Biden, although he likes to blame Biden for mismanagement of the crisis before and during, as post the invasion. So I think Trump came in as which was on the horizon as a possibility last year, and I think in some ways he's given more emphasis impetus towards discussions about peace, but he's been unwilling to bring the hammer down on the Russians so far. He's been unwilling to impose more sanctions or to use Russian assets to support Ukraine. And as we saw with Pete Hegseth in Congress, he seems to be wavering about actually supplying arms, although there was something to talk about that yesterday in The Hague. So, I think actually American policy has been pretty consistent before, during, and after Trump. They don't want a direct clash with Russia, and that has driven American policy and hence European policy um, over the last 3 years. And I think Trump sees Ukraine as a more European problem, doesn't see it as a fundamentally core issue for American security. And I think that's what's driving him to try and get a peace and at some stage this year, perhaps.
Hasn't he gone further in some respects? And we'll come back to that idea of maybe the misguided policy of understanding how to get Russia to do things that you want them to do. We'll come back to that one. But in some ways, hasn't Trump been a lot worse than Biden's administration in that not only is there no new munitions package on the horizon, they're also, at this point, that may change, they're denying the opportunity for Ukraine to even buy air defense equipment, thereby contributing to the rising death toll and giving Russian impunity. But they're also blocking things like the oil price cap. They are not pushing hard on secondary sanctions. They're not pushing hard on the Russian assets that are in Euroclear in Belgium. And they've lifted the commission on chasing oligarch money, on defending the US system against Russian electoral interference and other forms of cyber. In respects, if Biden was giving sort of half doses of medicine, Trump is adopting an almost homeopathic methodology where he's giving nothing at all and actually preventing the patient from being given medicine.
Well, that was certainly the case earlier this year, wasn't it, when America stopped the intelligence sharing briefly with the Ukrainians, gambling on Ukrainian lives to make a message to Zelensky to come to the table and talk. And I think you're right about this whole idea that America's being tapped along by Putin, and the Trump's been reluctant, very reluctant, to actually use a stick of American power towards Russia. But I think the Americans would say, or the administration would say, that at this stage, bringing the hammer down won't bring Russia to the table. They've been working on a principle of can we negotiate, and I think that path, of discussion may be closing, and that was the message that I think that Trump was getting loud and clear at the summit from European leaders, from people like the Chancellor of Germany, from people like Rutte, from people like our Prime Minister Starmer, that your approach isn't working, and what's happening instead is that Russia is killing Ukrainian civilians and grinding war forward in the battlefield. So I watched Trump's press conference yesterday, and I saw in the communique from the summit about Russia's long-term threat, I saw mention about Ukraine. We know Trump's reluctance, but of course, will he change his mind? That's the big question. And I think there's a moment there yesterday when the Ukrainian journalist in exile put a question to Trump, and it's really resonated, I thought, with him. And ultimately, politics is a matter of human interaction, and so is diplomacy. And if Putin carries playing Trump along, will Trump lose patience? That's what I think everybody's waiting for. And people like Ben Hodges has been lobbying for, and people like, Don Bacon and others, even people in the Republican Party say, Mr. President, you're being played here. But I think the other big problem, of course, is we had this track, with people in Saudi, and they're having meetings, and there was discussion and, negotiations, 2 rounds in Istanbul, or that's all fantastic. And then Israel strikes Iran, America strikes Iranian nuclear facilities, and the entire attention of the world and the administration has all shifted. So it'll take a while, I think, to regain Ukraine as an issue, to get space back in the administration, to allow them to refocus on it.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it? So Rubio in his recent statement exemplifies exactly what you're saying here, which is towards Russia. And I would almost describe this as an exceptional approach. It's as if Russia is a special case politically and psychologically, that you have to treat it with kid gloves, you have to appease it. And that seems to be at the heart of the policy, which is don't put pressure on Russia because they will not come to the table or give concessions. Whereas I think from your experience and the extensive writings of Keir Giles suggests that the absolute opposite is true. If you escalate with Russia in a way that they cannot predict and didn't expect, and you do it very sharply and forcefully, you may be able to actually get them to give concessions they wouldn't otherwise given. Now, I find it extraordinary that that is the exact approach the US has taken to Iran, and it seems to have worked. You smash them incredibly hard in a way that they weren't expecting, and then you give them the option as a sort of off ramp. And it seems they have been begging to come back to the table in a certain sense. So that is peace through strength. Now, some people would argue about the legalities of hitting Iran that way, but here there's an example of that kind of gunboat diplomacy that seems to work. Why is it that Russia is treated as an exception when
I don't,
perhaps
sorry.
yourself and Keir Giles would say that no, this could work with Russia?
Well, I've always accorded to the um, George Kennan approach that Russia respects the logic of force, not the logic of reason, and that if you're trying to reason with the Russians to come to a parley, to come to a deal, it's not going to work. You have to use carrots and sticks, and actually, something which is good in the Russian national interest, you have to bring to that position. So, I think you saw that in the sort of approach when they finally got to talk, direct talks to the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul. And the Russians came with a great big list of demands because they knew that it weren't being put under pressure by the Americans. And the terms hadn't changed for 3 years. It was the same terms they'd had in Istanbul 3 years before, where it's basically Ukraine surrender, neutrality, demilitarization, NATOization, and bringing Ukraine back into the Russian orbit. And then we've had Putin's comments last week, where it's even more so that all of Ukraine's ours. Ukraine doesn't exist. Yeah, all that. So I think the fallacy of the American approach, which has been the American approach since administration, and perhaps with Biden, is has run its road, shall we say? And I think if you look what's going to happen next, if Trump wants peace, which I think is noble, and he wants peace in Europe because he can focus on China, and he wants a problem to go away because America, he doesn't think that it's a core issue for America, then he's going to have to use some American power as he's used elsewhere in the world. And maybe he's got a bit of a spring in his step after Israel, Iran, and other thorny issues he thinks he's dealt with. But I think he was asked this question, and he implied basically it was more difficult than we expected to be. So I don't think the issue's gone away in Washington. I think hopefully the administration will have a time to refocus on it, and that they'll start to crank the pressure up on the Kremlin, because without that, this war's just going to go on and on and on forever, and it'll just degrade American interests in Europe. It'll distract from his presidency, and he won't get the Nobel Peace Prize.
It seems almost everything, and including many domestic policies, were, big surprise, far more complex than he previously thought they would be. But this phrase is interesting, that Ukraine is a European problem. And quite clear, and perhaps rightly so, Trump's kicked that back to Europe and said that Europe needs to step up. And some countries definitely are. The Baltics, Denmark, and now Germany, perhaps to an extent. That's extremely laudable and should be happening. But is he also of the mind that Europe is Europe's problem? And here we perhaps have an issue, which is that if Russia is minded to either test Article 5 in a sort of full threshold manner, direct manner, or do something sub-threshold, but which is quite momentous nonetheless, Europe may be left to fend for itself. Now, I know you're a bit of a skeptic about the sort of, the idea of Russia being all powerful and it's going to, horde of Russians are going to overtake Europe and invade Britain and all these kind of alarmist stuff. But is it actually quite likely that we're going to get some kind of sub-threshold tests in the next few months or year?
Well, I think firstly we are being attacked already by Russia in that area, the irregular, unconventional. And I think that was reflected in the UK's new national security strategy, that we'd have to do much more for resilience, to deter by denying space for Russia and China, Iran, other hostile state actors to operate, because we've abandoned that for 30 years. So people say, well, Russia could attack us. They're already attacking us through espionage and cyber and assassinations and political interference. So the Russia threat is real. It just doesn't. I don't think it's a conventional military threat, and neither does our Chief of Defence Staff, and neither does the US Defence Intelligence Agency at present. But I think on Trump's core issue, core geopolitical perspective, it is that China's the main problem, and that Russia's declining power. And this is why you see people in the administration say we need to focus on the Asia Pacific, and that give Russia to Europe. Europe needs to step up to deter Russia conventionally with the American backstop. And I think people were pleased yesterday that Trump said, "We've got your back." What the exact phrasing was in a press conference, that NATO, US will still remain engaged in NATO. The US has encouraged European NATO members to spend more on defence, up to 5% over the next 10 years. And they've got this sort of agreement that Russia's a long-term threat. So I think the White House is happy that they should kick the Europeans to spend more, and that will contribute to defence and deterrence. I think on the Ukraine issue, yes, I think Europe needs to do more, especially on arms, but not just the way of just donations of kit, which I think was very much 2022, 2023 approach. It's much more joint ventures with Ukrainian industry to build the stuff and to supply the Ukrainian armed forces with the stuff they need. So I think ultimately any countries can be reluctant to keep handing over missiles and tanks and kit and degrade their own defences. So I think if you get more into funding, industrial cooperation, production of joint ventures, that sort of thing. That will help Ukraine sustain its defenses. The problem is, of course, it's things like air defenses, which take years to build. America has them, and Ukrainian cities need them. And I think, Trump made a sort of comment yesterday about, well, we're looking at that, but he did balance it against our other commitments. They've got one in Israel, they've got there's attack in Qatar, in the Korean Peninsula, Japan. This is not an easy issue to deal with. But I mean, I think strategically, Trump's right. Europe should do more for its own defences. It shouldn't take a country of 350 million to prop up the security of a continent with 500 million. And that people were surprised back in February when Trump started to say this stuff. They were shrieking and saying it's disgraceful and it's betrayal and all this sort of stuff, appeasement. But actually, he's right. We've taken a European security holiday for 30 years, and it's now time to get serious on it. And I hope that the decisions taken in NATO this week, big decisions on spending, are now realised, and it's not just a game to smoke and mirrors and wait till Trump leaves. We need to spend more on our defence and deterrence here in Europe for the interests of our own citizens, and not wait for the Americans to come over the horizon every 40 years.
And isn't it in our own interests, in fact, to develop Ukraine's domestic military production? Because if we do that, we also share in the data and the insight and the evolution of that. Whereas if we hand over kit, or if we jealously guard kit we've got, it may well be that that kit is far less valuable than we actually think. In the age of drone warfare, these slightly older platforms are extremely vulnerable to fiber optic drones and these kind of things. So actually investing in development and co-development with Ukrainians, sort of testing and innovating, is by far and away the best thing we can do to help defend ourselves as well as Ukraine.
Yes, but I think it's a two-way street, isn't it? There was always this idea that we're the donor and they're the receiver. They should be grateful and supplicants. Well, actually, Ukraine's got the biggest army in Europe now, wholly in Europe. It's been fighting the Russians for 3 years and held them to a standstill, amazingly. They've got huge amounts of tactical expertise relevant for the development of the Western armed forces, and in particular, obviously, they're the kings of drones, and they've revolutionised the use of unmanned air vehicles over the last 3 years in all sorts of ways that nobody could have anticipated. Plus, the stuff they're taken to the Russians themselves and shown them to be very sneaky and have a very deep sort of understanding of the Russian psyche and the Russian military and society. So, yes, I think it's right. I mean, I'm on the record. I think Ukraine should be in NATO, but there is no consensus for that in the alliance. It wasn't dealt with this week in The Hague again. Ukraine's meant to be deemed on an irreversible path, but it's not just the Americans are against it. A lot of people are hiding behind America's coattails now under Trump. So that's been parked. That doesn't mean we shouldn't carry on, improving these ties and leaks and supporting Ukraine to defend itself. But I think ultimately having Ukraine in the alliance would help resolve, should we say, the security dilemma on the eastern frontier of NATO.
Well, let's turn to NATO and the UK defence review. Do these sort of changes, pronouncements, etc., do they actually create any deterrence power as far as Russia's concerned? And the talk about going to 5%, etc. Some of this seems to be posturing. Some of it seems to be accounting tricks, treasury spin, etc. I mean, what's Russia going to take seriously out of the NATO and UK defence review? And what is the stuff that it's potentially going to just look at as being a kind of bluff?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think the UK defence review took far too long. So, it was launched in June. It finally delivers after being presented to the Prime Minister in January, February, we went on 12 editions. But I think, broadly, I didn't see it as revolutionary. I thought it was evolutionary. There was some ideas in there to provide the framework. And I think it also rightly focused the UK's contribution to NATO in the maritime and air. So you see the army wasn't grown, but some of the promises about growth of nuclear submarines, growth of standoff weapons, cruise missiles, more ships, And now we've seen this decision to buy the F-35A to improve deep strike and contribute to the NATO nuclear mission. I think that was right. I think on the strategic defense review, there was a little bit too much tech enthusiasm about AI and cyber as the answers to the Maiden's Prayer, and that these things will compensate for mass. So you have the Russian model is mass firepower mobilization. The British and NATO British model is going to be, we'll use tech, unmanned air vehicles, using Ukrainian experience to augment our platforms to increase our lethality. Plus, of course, modernization and nuclear deterrent, which is absolutely crucial, which the UK's offered to NATO since the 1960s. So I think that was on that. I mean, I read the Chief of Defence Staff's report to Parliament. I think it was in last week, and he makes the point, of course, that we're already deterring Russia. Russia has been deterred and the Soviet Union before it, for attacking NATO territory. And now, I'm not saying deterrence doesn't need to be strengthened through credible, capable systems and communicated clearly to the Russian side, but there's more we can do. And I think viewers will know we're currently at 2.4% or whatever. We're going to go to 2.6% as Parliament, but to go from 2.6% to 3.5%, say 2.5 to 3.5, 1% of GDP. Our GDP is like £3 trillion. That's a mighty dollop of cash. So, irrespective of the strategic defence view was hamstrung by spending and no clear plan, if we're going to go to 3.5% in 10 years' time, that is a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. We haven't been there since the 1980s. So it will buy in some serious capability, not just the little nibbles in terms of nuclear submarines, aircraft, new nuclear submarines, the deterrent, plus new ships. And I think that will all help with our allies on the continent to improve deterrence and our defence. At the same time, a lot of the defence stuff we need to do isn't just military; it's actually civilian resilience. And I think the UK government's finally and NATO are finally woken up to the importance of that. So that's the other 1.5%. So together, if it's realised, it's not just talked about. I mean, I have an ambition to marry, Julia Roberts. It doesn't mean it's going to happen in 10 years' time. These things have to have a plan without actually a strategy to get there. It's just guff. So I would hope that this Parliament, next Parliament, we can actually move towards the 3.5% and achieve some degree of national consensus on the need to do that without blowing the economy up.
On nuclear, I struggle with the evidence of behaviors and the amount of money that's put into that. I mean, certainly nuclear is a good deterrence against a nuclear war, but it seems that the evidence of India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, and even Russia is that a nuclear deterrence is not a deterrent for a kinetic level confrontation. So if we put that much money into renewal of nuclear and yet have minimal working artillery pieces, we have a minimal army, and all sorts of other issues that require substantial investment, are we not sort of missing the wood for the trees in some sense?
No, I mean, I think, firstly, nuclear strategic missiles are the bedrock of our security and sovereignty. And also because we offer that to NATO. So it's not just for us, it's for the greater good, as I might say.
And the
But you're
EU
right.
to an extent. I mean, maybe
Well,
we
I mean,
talk about that at least.
Europe,
Yeah.
small e, So now that most European countries are in NATO, the whole issue about the places like Finland and Sweden has gone away. So you're left with like Austria, who apparently been talking about NATO miraculously, Switzerland, Ireland, and Malta and Cyprus. You're not talking about military superpowers here. Everybody else is in NATO, just about, or have good relationships with NATO. But you're right. I think I've been reading a lot about Russian deterrence thinking recently, and Russia has a very clear system of measures, forceful and non-forceful, kinetic and non-kinetic, in a system of strategic deterrence to deter attack on itself and also to coerce potential adversaries to not attack it, and in war to win. And they have this so-called escalation ladder of measures, both conventional, non-strategic nuclear, strategic nuclear, to achieve that. I think the strategic defence view was right that we need to strengthen our conventional deterrence. So there was talk about thousands of more cruise missiles, That's to hold Russian infrastructure at risk in the same way they hold our infrastructure at risk through Caliber and Iskander missiles and air missiles, which have been fired into Ukraine. And we need to get on with that. So I'm encouraged by UK German projects to develop 2,000-kilometer missiles, because I think the biggest gap we've got is not nuclear, strategic nuclear, and it's not tactical forces. It's that bit in the middle, intermediate nuclear forces and conventional forces. And I'd hope that would be, you know, on the equipment plan, which is going to be published in the autumn. I think on the army, you know, obviously I was in the Navy. And I was at the Land Warfare Conference, the British Army last week when they were talking about it. You know, ultimately, Britain, we live on an island, and we're a maritime power with continental interests. You know, we're different from Germany, which is a continental power with the maritime interests. And it's right, I think, in an alliance of 32 nations and 500 million people, that not everybody tries to do everything at the same time. You know, if Germany's going to go dramatically up in its spending, it's not going to be spending lots of money on its navy. It's going to be spending lots of money on its army, and so is Poland. And so is Finland. So the question is, how do we complement each other through air, land, and sea, nuclear, conventional, long range, medium range, short range, to get the right balance to achieve deterrence? And that's what I think the NATO capability targets are achieving. There's no point in us all having the same kit and missing, you know, what is crucial. I mean, I think for us, what do we provide to NATO? The nuclear deterrent, keeping the Atlantic open, and providing a strategic reserve to secure in times a credible strategic land reserve in time of war, which, to be honest, isn't that different from what we did in 1914 and 1939. So we should put aside issues of British Army on the Rhine or British Army on the Vistula. We've got a maritime strategy. Our, our military strategy is air sea, with we have to contribute land power. Let's deliver on that and not try and relitigate that, somehow that we need to go back to 55,000 people in Germany, because I don't think it's affordable, and I don't think it's logical either.
And does that, in some senses, make sense to have smaller units, smaller alliances to deliver on this capability? So, for instance, one could see Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Britain being able to concentrate on that sort of northern maritime approach. Is NATO too slow, bureaucratic, consensus driven? Should we be working through more agile alliances to focus on particular capabilities such as maritime navigation, trade route, deterring a lot of Russian provocation, which does seem to be based on attacking trade and communication routes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the alliance. But firstly, on the alliance, I was in NATO in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and then we were talking about the Russian threat. What does it all mean for NATO? And we've come a very long way from 2014 South Wales Summit, 2% to 2025 Hague Summit, 3.5%, plus all the reforms, plus new Allied Reaction Corps forces, greater forces at readiness now, not because before we had nothing. Greater expertise, greater understanding, greater investment in technical development, R&D, and intelligence. So NATO can work quicker, and it showed that in the Baltic, when there's now a new NATO command in northern Germany, and it's running a maritime operation to ensure the security of the Baltic after the allegations of Russian subterfuge in the area. So I think it's less bureaucratic. I mean, I think the price of freedom is bureaucracy. I think we're always going to have a bureaucracy in NATO. I think the question is NATO focusing on its key purpose, collective defence, and not trying to become a sort of security actor in absolutely everything, because I think it dilutes attention and focus. I mean, just on smaller groupings, the bedrock of our security is NATO, and the bedrock of that is nuclear weapons. But I think within that, regional focuses, as I said, the Navy, an island nation focusing on the sea is not a daft proposition. Uh, but we have the thing like the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is and the Northern Group, which is ginger groups within the alliance. And I think you're seeing more focus with the British Army in particular for a thing called the Forward Land Forces in Finland and the Baltics. in the time of crisis. So you're seeing greater links between the UK armed forces, Finland and Sweden and Norway, which again makes sense because if you think about where the major air threat's going to come to the UK from, it's not across Germany, Poland, Holland that way. It's going to come around the sea from the top. So I think a maritime focus on the northern flank makes sense to me. And I think that also fits in with the sort of vision the British Army has as to be, at about 100,000, including reserves, more agile, more diffused and highly lethal to be able to supplement the armies of those countries.
And here's perhaps a question you might take as far too cynical. But is there any truth in the idea that at the moment, NATO, its core priorities are actually appeasing Trump, trying to keep him on side, and to some extent, institutional preservation and growth, as opposed to Ukraine, which is at the bleeding edge of European security and is providing a shield against a wider Russian incursion into Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, um, the British foreign policy has been to keep the Americans in Europe since 1945, and arguably before that. Or because the lesson learnt was that without America there, as we saw rise of Hitler and German militarism, we have to keep the Americans in. Keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans and French down. As some wag put it, I don't think we're far off from that. Or we might say keep France and Germany from going to war every 25 years through binding them into sort of international institutions is a bad thing. And the UK's role as an offshore balancer, that's always been our role and our approach. So if it takes, you know, Mark Rutte being overly nice to Donald Trump, if it takes people backslapping Donald Trump, I don't care because I think the ends, European sovereignty and security, Atlantic security, keeping the Americans in is absolutely vital. And that's the core of our foreign policy approach to the NATO, and that's the way we achieve it. So I don't, people say, well, that's all disgraceful. I think it's the other way around, actually. Whatever it takes, as they used to say in the films. But I think there is sort of institutional baggage. I think the alliance has shorn off some of its tendencies, but there is always, I think, people in the organization. When I worked there, they believed NATO as a country. NATO is not a country. The Mark Rutte is not the general of NATO, the commander of NATO. NATO is the 32 members. It, it, each of whom has a vote, operates by consensus. Its kryptonite is unity, allied unity, and cohesion, and that's what Russia tries to attack. And that's, as a political alliance, staying together, spending more money, focusing on a common threat is what keeps the Russians out. I think on Ukraine, I think you're right. I mean, I think there are those in NATO who see keeping supporting Ukraine in a sort of Goldilocks, not too much, not too cold, is a way of bleeding, of degrading Russian combat power without them having to do it. I mean, and I think ultimately that became what was the heart of the Biden approach, is that long as British American troops are on the ground, as long as we're not in a combat situation with Russia, we can keep supporting Ukraine. They can do the fighting for us. Ukraine's our army. Well done, lads. Here's to have some more tanks. And I think that's deeply cynical, but ultimately, foreign policy, it can be highly cynical and ultra realist. I mean, I would hope that, as we said before, Trump brings more sticks, drives Russia to the table, achieves, some form of peace. But I don't think the peace is going to be palatable to most Ukrainians, or indeed most people inside the Kremlin. I think there's a path towards a unpalatable peace, but it has to be peace with honor, and it has to have the support of the Ukrainian people. It can't be ladled on top of them by NATO or by the Americans.
It seems after 3 years of sort of conversations that something's come into focus, and the core self-deterrence of Europe and the US in not wanting Ukraine and to have an outright win over Russia is not the immediate threat of nuclear war or some kind of tactical use of nuclear weapons. The greatest self-deterring fear seems to be the idea that Russia will collapse, the regime will collapse, and you'll have an emergent set of unstable states, nuclear armed states, ruled by warlords. That seems to be one of the, let's say, self-created fantasies that guides a lot of strategic thinking. Um, but actually, through this attritional approach, and not recognize that Putin is going to carry on, despite, many, and we saw this in the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Russian economists are now squealing about the existential threat to the Russian economy. Putin doesn't care, and he's going to carry on and on and on until some kind of cataclysm potentially happens to prevent Russia from being able to carry on militarily. So our policy to prevent a precipitous collapse of Russia may actually be making it more likely in the longer term. Do you buy into that thesis?
I never thought the war in Ukraine was going to bring about a precipitous collapse in Russia. It may be like a slow puncture. Um, I mean, I think the wider concern has been that the war in Ukraine would escalate from a local war, as the Russians call it, to a regional war with NATO. And I think there's been absolutely no desire in US or Europe, or indeed in Moscow, for that to happen. And that's the way it is, because unfortunately, Ukraine is not in NATO. And we can argue whether it should have been, under Bush, or whether Biden should have thrown more stuff at Ukraine to help defeat Russians in 2022, then they probably might have had a chance when Russia had shot its bolt and to kick them out. But when that didn't happen, and after the failure of the Ukrainian offensive in 2023, with the trajectory seems to be fixed. I think the other concern, of course, is that Russia achieving its goals to some degree in Ukraine leads to greater migration from Ukraine into Europe. So like a migration crisis, and I think also a hostile, you know, militarized Russia having troops on the Polish border is in nobody's interest. So I think that's what's driven the policy. So like fear of escalation versus a bit of realpolitik. But I've never thought that Russia. I mean, I think so. Fantasies are thrown around that we need to break Russia up. No, I don't think that's wise. Given its possession of nuclear weapons, it's not going to go away. I think the strategy of containing Russia is probably the right one. That was what we said in our previous national security strategy. I think in the UK, and I think that's what we're actually fundamentally doing. And I think that's recognised in Russia as well. That there's no going back to the good old days, we say. Cooperation is much more into confrontation and competition.
Containment would seem to be at least sensible because we can't know what will happen to Russia, and we probably have very little capability to influence it one way or the other. It also seems to me that what Ukraine is demonstrating is you can have an attritional war, a relatively static war, but punctuated by extraordinary success, as we saw with Spiderweb. And that then puts the emphasis on one, being able to support an attritional war with all the scale it requires, but at the same time being able to support an asymmetric warfare with extreme innovation and inventiveness and doing very unexpected things. To sort of wrap the conversation or to conclude it, how far does our defense review, our thinking, our re-engineering of military procurement processes recognize the need for mass, but also recognize the need for agility and innovation?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. The war shifted to one of production and mass and attrition in 2022, 23 is where we've been. The Russians dug in against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians dug in against the Russians. That's where we've been. But of course, as we saw in the First World War, if attritional wars don't mean the lack of innovation. In fact, we sat in attritional war from 1914 to 1918 and then managed to break the Germans through combined arms warfare, the tank, radio communications, just a whole set of new weapons, air power, the Royal Air Force, deep strikes, the torpedo, sonar. So yes, you can innovate to achieve. I mean, it doesn't mean that attrition is, immutable. Wars of maneuver can shift to ones of attrition and back to ones of maneuver, depending on the phase you are in the conflict. But I think our strategic defence review recognised that we have a technological advantage in the West over Russia. And I think Russia's production, military industrial production, it lacks access to Western tech. It's not getting that substituted effectively by China. It has problems with spending of R&D. It's got economic deficiencies. It's got capacity issues, management issues, corruption issues. Now, if Europe can get its act together, it can offset against Russian mass through ingenious use of firepower, UAVs, cyber drones, space, aircraft, stealth. And that's really been our approach. Each time Russia has sort of closed the gap, firstly nuclear weapons, we offset that against one approach, and then they equaled conventional mass, and then we offset against revolutionary military affairs. So I think there's always that sort of cat and mouse. And again, that will be great, but if we're actually going to do it, we have to spend money. So I would hope it does all trickle through into the programs, into moving away from Byzantine and hugely bureaucratic procurement processes into more agility, breaking the link, having like a defense side, a civilian side, having the two together, which again, I think the Ukrainians have shown us, a more patriotic industrial complex, as people have called it, and looking for better ideas from other people rather than just the traditional national champions. But it's going to be difficult. Europe's got a lot of overcapacity. It's got a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of national interests in there. Trying to get everybody to pull in the same direction is going to be difficult. Now, in some ways, I want to have competition because better ideas come that way. But I don't think Europe will be able to do it on its own. I think there'll always be a role for transatlantic industrial cooperation. And again, that was written into the declaration of the summit yesterday. It's a fantasy to think that Europe can stand alone industrially.
And Ukraine, I mean, maybe the subject of another conversation, but Ukraine is showing, or starting to show at least, because they're also attacking a legacy of sort of Soviet mindset and bureaucracy, and I would say political timidity in the face of innovation. But they're starting to implement competition at several levels in the military in terms of recruitment, but also looking at the sort of kill rates, the success rates, and that's then feeding into who gets resources and the actual procurement process itself. So extraordinary revolutions.
Well, I
This, of
mean, war
course,
is war. They always say war is the mother of invention, isn't it? Ukraine's in a war of national survival against an implacable enemy who's got more enemy people or more money and bigger armed forces and more industry. So it has to do that if it's going to survive. So I think there's bright spots in Ukraine. Drones, industrial production in some areas. The growth of the amount of stuff which is produced domestically in Ukraine is considerable. These new ventures, money, whatever. At the same time, there's areas which are lacking innovation, lacking agility, in particular in bits of the army and the land forces. So you can see they've got this new drone force, which is spectacularly successful in offsetting Russian advantage. But there's huge criticisms about mobilization, about defensive production, which is about organization management. So, it's a bit of a curious act, to be honest. I would hope that the Ukrainians armed forces, if they're on the defensive, which they are fully adopt the defensive and don't distract themselves to a degree through vainglorious offensive operations, which just waste people and other energy for the main effort.
I think we found that in the Second World War, didn't we? Challenging hierarchies, challenging,
Yeah,
standard promotion processes based on age and maturity rather than necessarily results. Ukraine is still trying to tackle some of those, let's say, Soviet hierarchical things. And they'll need to promote talent. They'll need to promote people, beyond the normal,
yeah. That's the same
scale to
American Civil
achieve.
War. It's First
Yep.
War as well. We went through countless rounds of sackings and until we happened upon the right generals. It was 4 years between 39 and 42, 43 when the time turned, really, for Al Alamein. And that's a long time of failure.
A lot of
And get
lives
a
lost
lot of
in while
lives. You
those
go for
lessons
that.
are
And even
learned. Yeah.
look at the Soviet experience from where they were in 41, so standing on the rubble of Berlin in 45. So this stuff is extremely difficult to try and reform yourself in contact with the enemy who's trying to destroy you. it's extremely difficult because nobody has the capacity intellectually or even physically to be able to do it. And it normally takes serious reverses to actually Dunkirk, Norway, whatever, to actually bring about that in change. But there's a long way from Dieppe through to Normandy in terms of innovation. But it was spurred by disaster. It wasn't spurred by victory.
And unfortunately, Russia's not entirely immune to achieving some level of innovation and change as well as we're
Yeah,
seeing. We've
unfortunately, as we've seen, yeah.
underestimated them, overestimated them, and swung wildly between the
Yes,
two.
I mean, I've been looking at this. I mean, I think, Russia's innovation is normally driven to a set of sort of tactical circumstances from the bottom up. It's not come from the general staff, from the system. So, by fine, they've copied, they're quite good at, yes, that's what the Ukrainians do. We'll copy that, which will offset that. But I don't think you've seen systemic reform because, one, Putin's regime's not, it's very conservative insular, doesn't want to reform things because it likes the status quo. That's what it understands. And two, they've got the same problem. They're fighting the war and they've got a lot of pressure from Putin on top and trying to get someone um, time and space to think about more systemic, wider defence reform is going to prove very difficult. And I think every day the Ukrainians keep holding the Russians back, that delays that Russian process of military reform by another day. Another good reason for us to keep supporting Ukraine.
Absolutely. That's a great place to end. John, some fantastic insights in this episode. I'm very grateful to you for coming back on and sharing those with the audience. And I strongly encourage them to watch our previous conversations and, of course, the many other conversations you have on other platforms as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.